settle in. This one starts quiet. It starts with a missing person report filed on a Tuesday morning, filed by a co-worker who noticed an empty desk and an unanswered phone. The missing person was Daniel Garrett, 34, financial analyst at Meridian Capital Group, 14th floor of the Harcourt building downtown. He had worked late the night before. Security logged him entering at 7:42 in the evening. He never logged out. When his supervisor arrived Tuesday morning and found his office door locked from the inside, she assumed he had stepped out, but his coat was still on the chair. His coffee mug sat half full on the desk, cold, and the window behind his desk, the one that faced east toward the financial district, was wide open. 14th floor, no balcony, no ledge wide enough to stand on. The Harcourt building is not old. It was completed 6 years ago, all glass and steel and keycard access on every floor. The windows are sealed units, double-paned, climate-controlled. They do not open. Except this one did. I arrived at the scene on Tuesday afternoon. I am a private investigator, but I also do contract work for a documentary production company that covers unsolved cases. Meridian Capital had hired me quietly, not through their legal team, but through a back channel, a senior partner who wanted answers before the press got involved. That should have been my first warning. The office was still sealed when I got there. Building security had taped off the door. A detective from the downtown precinct, a woman named Alvarez, was standing in the hallway with a notepad, looking annoyed. She looked at me. She said, "You the consultant?" I said yes. She said, "Then consult quietly." The office was small. Desk, chair, filing cabinet, a narrow bookshelf. The window was maybe 4 feet wide, open fully, hinged outward from the bottom. Rain had blown in and soaked the carpet beneath it. The papers on the desk were dry. That told me the window had been opened recently, after the rain started, which was around 11 the night before, according to weather records. Daniel Garrett's laptop was still on. The screen was locked, password protected. His briefcase sat beside the desk closed. His phone was in the briefcase, also locked. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No torn fabric. No scratches on the windowsill. Detective Alvarez walked the room slowly. She said, "You see any way he goes out that window accidentally?" I said no. She said, "You see any way someone throws him out without leaving a mark?" I said no again. She nodded. She said, "So either he jumped, or someone made it look like he jumped, or he is somewhere else and this is staging." I asked about security footage. She said, "Already pulled it. He enters the building at 7:42. No one else enters his office after that. No one leaves. The hallway camera shows his door the whole night. It never opens." I looked at the door. Standard office door, wood veneer, key card lock on the outside, manual thumb turn lock on the inside. It locks automatically when it closes. You need a key card to get in from the hallway. You can leave by just turning the thumb turn and pulling the door shut behind you. I asked, "Who has key card access to this office?" Alvarez checked her notes. She said, "Garrett himself, his supervisor, Linda Marsh, facilities manager, Ron Pelletier, Building security has a master override, but that logs separately. I asked if anyone used a master override that night. She said no. I walked to the window. The hinges were on the bottom edge. You pushed the top out to open it. There was a small latch mechanism on the side, the kind you twist to release. I leaned out carefully. 14 floors down. Wet pavement. No awning, no scaffolding, no window washing rig. I asked, "Why does this window open?" Alvarez said, "Fire code variance. This building has a suppression system malfunction on floors 12 through 16. Until it is fixed, they are required to have operable windows for emergency ventilation. This is the only office on 14 with one installed." That felt convenient. I pulled back inside. I looked at the carpet near the window. There were faint shoe prints in the wet sections, partial treads, hard to read, but visible under the right angle of light. I crouched down. The prints were small, maybe a size 8 or 9. Daniel Garrett wore a size 11, according to the shoes under his desk. I pointed this out. Alvarez wrote it down. She said, "Could be from earlier. Cleaning crew." I asked when cleaning crew last accessed the office. She checked her phone. She said, "Sunday night. This is Tuesday." I said, "The rain started Monday night. These prints are in rainwater." She looked at me. She said, "So someone else was in here?" I said, "Or Garrett wore different shoes." She did not look convinced. We left the office and went downstairs to security. The building manager, a man named Ed Krause, pulled up the access logs on his computer. He was nervous. He kept adjusting his glasses. He said, "Daniel Garrett swiped in at the main lobby at 7:42. He swiped into the 14th floor stairwell door at 7:45. No other swipes after that." I asked about cameras. He pulled up footage. Lobby camera showed Garrett entering alone, wearing a dark coat, carrying his briefcase. He looked calm. He walked to the elevators, waited, got in. Elevator had no camera. 14th floor hallway camera picked him up exiting the elevator at 7:46. He walked down the hall, swiped his keycard at his office door, entered. Door closed behind him. Timestamp 7:47. I watched the footage for the rest of the night. No one approached the door. No one entered. No one left. The hallway was empty until 6:53 the next morning, when a janitor walked past, pushing a cart. I asked, "What about the stairwell?" Krause switched to the stairwell camera. It covered the door from the hallway side. No one used it between 7:45 and 6:15 the next morning. Alvarez said, "So he is still in the office, or he left through the window." I said, "Or the footage is edited." Krause looked offended. He said, "This system does not allow edits. It writes directly to a secured server. Timestamps are verified by an external sync." I asked who had access to the server. He said, "Me, our IT contractor, and corporate security at Meridian." I asked for the IT contractor's name. He hesitated. He said, "Ron Pelletier, the facilities manager, the one with keycard access to Garrett's office." I asked to speak with Ron Pelletier. Kraus said he was off today. I asked for his number. Kraus wrote it down on a sticky note and handed it to me. His hand was shaking slightly. Detective Alvarez and I left the building. Outside, the rain was still falling, lighter now, a mist more than a pour. She lit a cigarette under the awning and said, "You think Pelletier scrubbed the footage?" I said, "I think the window opens, the door stays locked, and no one is on camera. Those three things do not fit together, unless someone made them not fit." She took a drag. She said, "Garrett could have jumped." I said, "Then where is he?" She nodded. She said, "Search teams checked the surrounding blocks. No body. No reports of anyone falling. No blood on the pavement below the window." I looked up at the building. 14 floors of glass. Rain streaking down. One window on the 14th floor, still open. Curtains moving in the wind. I said, "I want to talk to his supervisor, Linda Marsh." Alvarez checked her phone. She said, "She is at the Meridian main office across town. I will let her know you are coming." I walked to my car. The sticky note with Ron Pelletier's number was in my pocket. I did not call him yet. I wanted to know more first. The Meridian Capital main office was in a different building, older, brick and granite, the kind that still had revolving doors and marble floors. I met Linda Marsh in a conference room on the 3rd floor. She was in her 40s, trim, wearing a grey suit. She looked tired. She sat down across from me and folded her hands on the table. She said, "Daniel was a good analyst, quiet, reliable. I do not understand what happened." I asked how long he had worked at Meridian. She said, 3 years. He transferred from our Denver office. He worked on compliance audits, mostly internal reviews. I asked if he had any conflicts with anyone at the company. She hesitated. She said, "Not that I knew of." I said, "That hesitation says you are not sure." She looked at me. She said, "There was an issue 6 months ago. Daniel flagged a discrepancy in one of our client accounts, a series of transfers that did not match the authorization logs. He reported it to me, and I escalated it to our risk management team." I asked what happened. She said, "They investigated. They said it was a clerical error. The client confirmed the transfers were legitimate. The issue was closed." I asked who the client was. She said, "I cannot tell you that." I said, "Daniel is missing. A clerical error does not make someone vanish." She stared at the table. She said, "The client was Halcyon Properties. They are a real estate investment group. They have been with us for 8 years." I asked if Daniel accepted that explanation. She said, "He did not push back, but he asked me a few weeks later if I had checked the transfer logs again. I told him the case was closed. He dropped it." I asked if anyone at Halcyon Properties knew Daniel had flagged the discrepancy. She said, "Risk management would have contacted them during the investigation. So yes, they would have known." I wrote that down. I asked if Daniel had been working late recently. She said, "Yes. For the past 2 weeks, he said he was reviewing a new client portfolio. He did not say which one." I asked if she knew what he was working on the night he disappeared. She said, "No. His laptop is password protected. IT has not cracked it yet. I asked about Ron Pelletier. Her expression shifted. She said, "What about him?" I said, "He has access to the security server. He has keycard access to Daniel's office. And he is off work today." She said, "Ron has worked for the building for 4 years. He is reliable." I said, "Has Daniel ever mentioned him?" She said, "Not to me." I asked if Meridian had any connection to Ron Pelletier outside of the building. She said no. Then she stopped. She said, "Actually, I do not know. Facilities contracts go through corporate. I do not handle that." I asked who did. She said, "Our CFO, Martin Lyle." I asked if I could speak with him. She said, "He is traveling. He will be back Thursday." I stood up. I said, "If you hear from Daniel, call me immediately." She nodded. She said, "Do you think he is alive?" I said, "I think someone opened that window for a reason." I left the building and sat in my car. The rain had stopped. The city looked grey and wet and cold. I called the number for Ron Pelletier. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I did not leave a message. I called Detective Alvarez. I said, "I need a warrant for Pelletier's financials." She said, "On what basis?" I said, "He has access, he has means, and he is the only one who could have altered the footage without leaving a log entry." She said, "That is not enough for a warrant." I said, "Then I will ask him myself." She said, "Do not do that." I hung up. I drove to the address listed for Ron Pelletier in the building directory. It was a small house on the south side, near the industrial corridor. The lights were off. No car in the driveway. I parked across the street and waited. An hour passed. No movement. I got out and walked to the front door. I knocked. No answer. I looked through the front window. The interior was dark. I could see a couch, a coffee table, a television. I walked around to the back. The yard was small, fenced. There was a shed in the corner. The door was padlocked. I looked through a gap in the wood slats. Inside, I could see tools, a workbench, and something else. A cardboard box with the Meridian Capital logo on the side. I took a picture with my phone. I walked back to my car. I called Alvarez again. I said, "Pelletier has Meridian materials in his shed." She said, "That could be anything." I said, "Or it could be evidence." She sighed. She said, "I will try to get a warrant. Do not go back there." I said I would not. I was lying. I drove back to the Harcourt building. It was late now, almost 9. The lobby was empty except for a security guard at the desk. I showed him my consultant ID. He waved me through. I took the elevator to 14. The hallway was quiet. The tape was still across Daniel Garrett's door. I looked at the camera in the ceiling. I wondered if someone was watching. I walked to the stairwell and pushed through the door. The stairwell was concrete and cold. I went up 1 floor to 15, then walked down the hallway, looking for an office directly above Garrett's. I found it. The door was unlocked. I went inside. The layout was identical. Same desk, same chair, same window. I walked to the window and looked down. Directly below was Garrett's office, window still open. I could see the curtains moving. I opened the window in the 15th floor office. I leaned out and looked at the exterior wall. Smooth glass panels, no handholds, no maintenance ladder, no way to climb down. But there was a thin ledge, maybe 2 inches wide, where the window frame met the wall. If someone was desperate or skilled, they could theoretically move along it, but it would be insane. 14 floors up. Rain, wind, one slip, and you are gone. I closed the window and left the office. I took the stairs back down to 14. I stood in the hallway outside Garrett's office and stared at the door. Something was wrong. Something about the timeline. Something about the locked door and the open window and the wet footprints that did not match. I went back downstairs. The security guard looked up. I asked if I could see the footage from 15 again, the hallway and stairwell from Monday night. He pulled it up. I watched. No one entered or exited the 15th floor hallway between 7 and midnight. No one used the stairwell. I thanked him and left. Outside, the rain had started again. I sat in my car and reviewed my notes. Daniel Garrett enters the building at 7:42. He swipes into his office at 7:47. No one is recorded entering or leaving after that. The window is found open Tuesday morning. There are wet footprints near the window, smaller than Garrett's shoe size. Ron Pelletier has access to the security system and to Garrett's office. Pelletier is off work. Pelletier has Meridian materials in his shed. And Daniel Garrett had flagged a financial discrepancy 6 months ago involving a client named Halcyon Properties. I pulled out my phone and searched for Halcyon Properties. The website was clean, professional. Commercial real estate investments, office buildings, apartment complexes, retail spaces. The executive team page showed 3 names: Richard Stern, CEO, Angela Morrison, COO, and Martin Lyle, CFO. Martin Lyle, the same Martin Lyle who was CFO at Meridian Capital. I sat back. I stared at the rain on the windshield. Martin Lyle worked for both companies. That was not illegal. But it was a connection, a thread. I called Alvarez. I said, Martin Lyle is CFO at both Meridian and Halcyon Properties. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that is interesting. I said, Daniel flagged a discrepancy involving Halcyon 6 months ago. Now Daniel is gone, and Lyle is traveling. She said, traveling where? I said, I do not know, but I want to find out. She said, I will make some calls. I hung up. I started the car. I drove back to my apartment. I made coffee. I sat at my desk and went through everything again. The locked office, the open window, the missing man, the footprints, the access logs, the footage, the connection between Meridian and Halcyon, the CFO who worked for both, and Ron Pelletier, the facilities manager who had access to everything and was not answering his phone. I finished my coffee. I checked my phone. No messages. No calls. I lay down on the couch. I did not sleep. I kept thinking about that window, about how it opened from the inside, about how someone would have to be in the room to open it, unless they were not. unless the window was opened later, after Garrett was already gone, to make it look like he jumped. But if he did not jump, and he did not leave through the door, then where did he go? I closed my eyes. The rain kept falling outside. The city hummed. Somewhere out there, Daniel Garrett was either dead or hiding. And someone had gone to a lot of trouble till I woke up early. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, but the streets were still wet, reflecting the grey morning light. I made more coffee and checked my phone. Still nothing from Ron Pelletier. No messages from Alvarez. I drove back to Pelletier's house. It was 6:30 in the morning. The neighborhood was quiet. A few porch lights were on. No one was outside yet. Pelletier's driveway was still empty. The house looked the same as the night before, dark and closed up. I parked down the block and waited. I wanted to see if he came home. I wanted to see if anyone else showed up. An hour passed. A man 3 houses down came out and got into his truck. A woman walked a dog past my car without looking at me. The sun was up now, pale and cold behind thin clouds. At 7:45, a car turned onto the street. A dark blue sedan. It slowed as it approached Pelletier's house, then pulled into the driveway. A man got out. He was in his 50s, heavy build, wearing jeans and a work jacket. He walked to the front door, unlocked it, and went inside. I waited 5 minutes, then got out of my car and walked up to the house. I knocked on the door. The man opened it. He looked at me with tired eyes. He said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Ron Pelletier?" He said, "Yeah." "Who are you?" I showed him my ID. I said, "I am working with the police on the Daniel Garrett case. I need to ask you some questions." His expression shifted. He said, "I already talked to the police." I said, "When?" He said, "Yesterday. A detective called me. I told her everything I know." I said, "Can I come in?" He hesitated, then stepped aside. I walked into the house. The interior was neat, but worn. Old furniture, clean floors, a few pictures on the walls, family photos. A younger version of Pelletier with a woman and 2 kids. He closed the door behind me. He said, "I do not know anything about what happened to Daniel Garrett." I said, "You have keycard access to his office." He said, "So does his supervisor. So does building security." I said, "You also have access to the security server." He crossed his arms. He said, "I maintain the system. That is my job." I said, "Did anyone ask you to alter footage from Monday night?" His face went hard. He said no, and I did not alter anything. I said, "Then why do you have Meridian Capital Materials in your shed?" He stared at me. He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "I saw a box with the Meridian logo in your shed last night." He uncrossed his arms. He walked to the back door and opened it. He said, "Come with me." We walked outside to the shed. He unlocked the padlock and pulled the door open. Inside was exactly what I had seen before. Tools, workbench, and the cardboard box. He pulled the box out and opened it. Inside were old computer cables, a broken monitor, and some paperwork. He pulled out one of the papers and showed it to me. It was a disposal authorization form from Meridian Capital, dated 2 years ago, signed by a facilities coordinator. The form listed the items in the box as surplus equipment cleared for disposal. He said, "I buy old electronics from office buildings. I refurbish them and sell them online. This box came from a clean-out sale 2 years ago. It has nothing to do with Daniel Garrett." I looked at the form. It looked legitimate. I said, "Do you know Daniel Garrett personally?" He said, "I have seen him in the building. We have never spoken." I said, "Have you ever been inside his office?" He said, "Once. 6 months ago. His thermostat was broken. I replaced it. That is the only time." I said, "Do you know anyone at Halcyon Properties?" He frowned. He said, "No." "Why?" I said, "They are a client of Meridian. Martin Lyle is CFO at both companies." He shook his head. He said, "I do not know Martin Lyle. I do not know anything about clients. I fix buildings." I believed him. His answers were too plain, too tired. If he was hiding something, he was better at it than most people I have met. But I do not think he was hiding anything. I think he was just a man with a job who happened to have access to things, and now he was caught in the middle of something he did not understand. I said, "If anyone contacts you about the security footage, call me immediately." He said he would. I left. I sat in my car and called Alvarez. I said, "Pelletier is not our guy." She said, "You sure?" I said, "He does not fit. He has no motive. He has no connection to Garrett or Halcyon." She said, "Then who does?" I said, "Martin Lyle." She said, "The CFO is still traveling. I checked with Meridian. He is in Seattle at a conference. He has been there since Sunday." I said, "So, he has an alibi?" She said, "A very clean one." I asked if she had gotten the warrant for Pelletier's financials. She said, "No. Judge said there is not enough cause. No evidence of a crime yet." I said, "A man is missing." She said, "A man walked into his office and did not walk out. That is not a crime. That is a mystery." I said, "What about the footprints?" She said, "Forensics is analyzing them. They will have results by tomorrow." I hung up. I drove back to the Harcourt building. I wanted to look at the office again. I wanted to see if I had missed something. The security guard recognized me. He waved me through. I took the elevator to 14. The hallway was empty. The tape was still across the door. I ducked under it and used the key card Alvarez had given me. The office was colder than before. The window was still open. Someone had placed a plastic sheet over the wet carpet to preserve the footprints. I stepped carefully around it and walked to the desk. I opened the drawers. Files, pens, a stapler, a box of business cards. Nothing unusual. I checked the filing cabinet. More files. Client reports. Compliance audits. Everything labeled and organized. I sat down in the chair and looked at the laptop. Still locked. I did not have the password. I did not have access to Garrett's phone either. Everything that might tell me What he was working on was sealed behind encryption. I looked at the bookshelf. Standard business books, a few novels, a framed photo of a woman and a young boy, maybe 6 or 7. I picked up the photo. The back had a label, Chloe and Max Summer, no year. I took a picture of the photo with my phone. I would ask Linda Marsh about it later. I walked back to the window. I leaned out again, looking at the street below. No blood, no body, no sign that anyone had fallen. The pavement was clean. I pulled back inside and looked at the window frame. The latch was simple, a twist mechanism. I twisted it closed, then open again. Easy, no force required. Anyone could open it. I looked at the hinges on the bottom. They were standard hardware, screwed into the frame. I checked the screws. None of them were stripped or loose. The window had not been forced. I closed the window and locked it. I stood in the middle of the room and tried to reconstruct the scene. Daniel Garrett enters at 7:47. He is alone. He sits at his desk. He works on something. At some point, the window is opened. At some point, Garrett is no longer in the room. No one is seen entering or leaving on camera. The door stays locked. The only explanation that made sense was that Garrett left through the window. But if he fell, where was the body? If he climbed down, how? If someone pushed him, who? And why were the footprints near the window, smaller than his shoes? I left the office and locked the door behind me. I took the elevator down to the lobby and walked to the security desk. The guard looked up. I said, "Can you show me the footage from the garage?" He said, "Which garage?" I said, "The employee garage. Monday night." He pulled it up. The garage had 3 levels, each covered by cameras. I watched the footage from Monday evening. Cars entering and exiting, people walking to and from the elevators, normal activity. At 8:15, a black SUV pulled into a space on the 2nd level. A man got out. He was wearing a dark coat and a baseball cap. He walked to the elevator and disappeared from view. I asked the guard to freeze the frame. I looked at the license plate. I took a picture of it. I asked, "Do you recognize that vehicle?" He squinted at the screen. He said no, but I can check the access log. He typed on his keyboard. He said, "That plate is registered to a visitor pass, issued to a guest of Meridian Capital." I asked who issued it. He said, "Linda Marsh." I felt my pulse pick up. I said, "What time did the SUV leave?" He scrolled through the footage. He said, 10:37. I asked if the same man drove it out. He played the footage. The SUV backed out of the space. The driver was wearing the same coat and cap. I could not see his face. I said, "Can you get a better angle?" He switched to a different camera. The angle was worse. The driver kept his head down. I asked for a copy of the footage. He burned it to a USB drive and handed it to me. I left the building and sat in my car. I called Alvarez. I said, "Linda Marsh issued a visitor pass Monday night, a black SUV. I need you to run the plate." She said, "Send it to me." I texted her the photo. A minute later, she called back. She said, "The plate is registered to a rental company, Enterprise. rented Monday morning to a Richard Stern. I said, Richard Stern, CEO of Halcyon Properties. She said, correct. I said, he was in the building Monday night. She said, that does not mean he was involved. I said, he is connected to Martin Lyle. Lyle is connected to Meridian. Garrett flagged a discrepancy involving Halcyon. Now Garrett is missing, and Stern was in the building the night he disappeared. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I will bring him in for questioning. I said, do it today. She said, I will try. I hung up. I drove to the Meridian main office. I found Linda Marsh in the same conference room as before. She looked surprised to see me. I said, you issued a visitor pass to Richard Stern on Monday night. Her face went pale. She said, how did you know that? I said, security footage. Why was he here? She looked at the table. She said, he called me Monday afternoon. He said he needed to meet with Daniel. He said it was urgent. I said, about what? She said, he did not say. I told him Daniel was working late. I issued a pass so he could access the garage and the 14th floor. I said, did you tell Daniel that Stern was coming? She said, no. Stern said he wanted it to be a surprise. He said they were old friends. I said, were they? She said, I do not know. I assume they were. I sat down across from her. I said, did you see Stern that night? She said, no. I left at 6. I assumed he met with Daniel after I was gone. I said, Stern left the building at 10:37. Do you know if he met with Daniel? She shook her head. She said, I have not spoken to Stern since Monday afternoon. I said, do you know what Daniel was working on that night? She said, no. He did not tell me. I said, did Martin Lyle ever ask you about Daniel's work? She hesitated. She said, once, a few weeks ago. He asked if Daniel was still reviewing the Halcyon account. I told him the case was closed. He said, good. I said, why did he ask? She said, he did not say. I assumed he wanted to make sure we were not wasting resources on a resolved issue. I said, or he wanted to make sure Daniel had stopped looking. She stared at me. She said, you think Martin is involved? I said, I think Martin Lyle works for both Meridian and Halcyon. I think Daniel found something 6 months ago that connected them. I think Richard Stern showed up Monday night to make sure Daniel stopped looking. And I think something went wrong. She said, what do you mean something went wrong? I said, I mean Daniel is missing. And the last person to see him was Richard Stern. She put her hands over her face. She said, oh God. I said, I need you to get me into Daniel's laptop. She looked up. She said, I do not have his password. I said, then get IT to crack it. Today. She nodded. She said, I will try. I left the building. I sat in my car and checked my phone. Alvarez had texted me, Stern is coming in at 2 p.m. Be there if you want. I texted back, I will be there. I drove to the downtown precinct. It was 1:45. I waited in the lobby. Alvarez came down at 1:50. She said, "He is bringing a lawyer." I said, "Good. That means he is worried." At 2 o'clock, Richard Stern walked in with a man in a suit. Stern was in his 60s, tall, grey hair, expensive watch. The lawyer was younger, sharp-eyed, carrying a briefcase. Alvarez led them to an interview room. I followed. The lawyer said, "My client is here voluntarily. He has nothing to hide." Alvarez said, in quote, "Then he will not mind answering a few questions." We sat down. Alvarez started a recorder. She said, "Mr. Stern, can you tell me why you visited the Harcourt building on Monday night?" Stern glanced at his lawyer. The lawyer nodded. Stern said, "I went to see Daniel Garrett. We had a business matter to discuss." Alvarez said, "What kind of business matter?" Stern said, "A financial discrepancy involving one of our accounts. Daniel had flagged it months ago. I wanted to reassure him that it had been resolved." I said, "Why did you not call him?" Stern looked at me. He said, "I prefer face-to-face conversations for sensitive matters." I said, "What was sensitive about it?" He said, "The discrepancy involved client funds. We did not want any misunderstandings." I said, "Did you meet with Daniel?" Stern hesitated. He said, "No." Alvarez leaned forward. She said, "You drove to the building. You parked in the garage. You took the elevator to the 14th floor, but you did not meet with him?" Stern said, "I went to his office. The door was locked. I knocked. He did not answer. I assumed he had stepped out. I waited for 15 minutes, then I left." I said, "What time was this?" He said, "I arrived around 8:30. I left around 8:45. I said, "Security footage shows you leaving the garage at 10:37. His face tightened. He said, "I may have waited longer than I thought." I said, "You waited almost 2 hours?" He said, "I made some phone calls in my car. I lost track of time." Alvarez said, "Can you show me your phone records?" The lawyer said, "My client is not obligated to provide that." Alvarez said, "He is, if I get a warrant." Stern said, "I have nothing to hide." He pulled out his phone and opened his call log. He handed it to Alvarez. She looked at it. She said, "You made 3 calls between 8:45 and 10:30. Each call lasted less than 5 minutes." Stern said, "I also answered emails." Alvarez handed the phone back. She said, "Did you see anyone else on the 14th floor?" Stern said, "No. The hallway was empty." I said, "Did you open Daniel Garrett's office door?" He said, "No. I told you, it was locked." I said, "Did you open the window in his office?" He stared at me. He said, "What window?" I said, "The window behind his desk. It was found open Tuesday morning." He said, "I did not go into his office. I did not open any window." The lawyer said, end quote, "My client has answered your questions. Unless you have evidence of a crime, we are leaving," end quote. Alvarez looked at me. I shook my head. We did not have enough. Stern and his lawyer stood up. Stern said, "I hope you find Daniel. He is a good man. They left. Alvarez turned off the recorder. She said, "He is lying." I said, "About what?" She said, "About waiting in his car. No one waits 2 hours for a meeting that did not happen." I said, "Unless he did meet with Daniel, and something happened." She said, "Then where is Daniel?" I said, "I do not know, but Stern knows more than he is telling us." I left the precinct. I drove back to my apartment. I made coffee and sat at my desk. I pulled up the footage from the garage on my laptop. I watched it again. The black SUV entering at 8:15. The man in the coat and cap getting out. The SUV leaving at 10:37. I paused the frame when the man got out. I zoomed in on his face. The cap obscured most of it, but I could see his jaw, his build. It looked like Stern, but I could not be certain. I watched the exit footage. The driver kept his head down, same coat, same cap. But something felt different. The way he moved, the way he held his shoulders. I played it again, and again. Then I saw it. When the man entered, he walked with a slight limp, favoring his right leg. When the man left, there was no limp. I sat back. I rewound the footage and played it again. I was right. The man entering the garage had a limp. The man leaving did not, which meant two things. Either Richard Stern suddenly healed his limp in 2 hours, or the man who left in the SUV was not Richard Stern I called Alvarez. I said, the man who left the building in Stern's SUV was not Stern. She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Stern has a limp. The man entering the garage has it. The man leaving does not." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send me the footage." I sent it. 5 minutes later, she called back. She said, "You are right. That is 2 different people." I said, "Which means someone else drove Stern's vehicle out of the garage." She said, "Or Stern is faking the limp." I said, "Why would he do that?" She said, "I do not know, but we need to bring him back in." I said, "He will just lawyer up again." She said, "Then we need more evidence." I said, "I need to get into Daniel's laptop." She said, "Work on it. I will work on Stern." I hung up. I called Linda Marsh. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Did IT crack the laptop?" She said, "Not yet. They are still working on it. They said it might take another day." I said, "I need it today." She said, "I will tell them." I said, "Did Daniel ever mention Richard Stern to you?" She said, "No, never." I said, "Did he ever mention Martin Lyle outside of work context?" She said, "No. Why?" I said, "I am trying to understand the connection." She said, "What connection?" I said, "Between Halcyon and Meridian, between Stern and Lyle, between whatever Daniel found and why he is missing." She said, "You think they are connected?" I said, "I know they are. I just do not know how yet." She said, "I will call you as soon as IT finishes." I hung up. I sat at my desk and pulled up everything I could find on Halcyon Properties. The company had been around for 12 years. They owned commercial properties in 6 states. Their portfolio was worth roughly $400 million. Richard Stern founded the company. Martin Lyle joined as CFO 4 years ago, the same year he started working at Meridian Capital. That was the key. Lyle worked for both companies. He had access to both sets of books. He could move money between them. He could hide discrepancies. He could make transfers look legitimate when they were not. And Daniel Garrett had noticed something 6 months ago. Something that did not fit. Something that risk management had dismissed as a clerical error. But what if it was not an error? What if it was deliberate? What if Lyle was moving money from Meridian clients into Halcyon accounts? What if Stern knew about it? What if they were working together? That would be embezzlement. That would be fraud. That would be a motive. I pulled up the financial filings for Halcyon Properties, public records. I went through the quarterly reports for the past 2 years. The numbers looked clean, revenue steady, expenses reasonable, no red flags. Then I looked at the investment activity. Halcyon had purchased 3 new properties in the past 18 months. An office complex in Portland, a retail center in Denver, an apartment building in Phoenix. Total acquisition cost, $92 million. I cross-referenced the purchase dates with Meridian Capital's client account activity. I did not have access to Meridian's internal records, but I could see public transactions tied to their managed funds. And there it was. 6 months ago, Meridian transferred $11 million from a client real estate fund into a holding account. The transfer was listed as a portfolio rebalancing. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. Except the holding account was registered to a shell company called Crescent Advisors LLC. And Crescent Advisors had the same business address as Halcyon Properties. I sat back. I stared at the screen. Lyle had moved $11 million from Meridian into a shell company tied to Halcyon. He had disguised it as a rebalancing, and Daniel Garrett had flagged it. Risk management had called it a clerical error, but it was not. It was theft. And now Daniel was missing. I called Alvarez. I said, I found it. Lyle moved $11 million from Meridian into a shell company tied to Halcyon. Garrett caught it. That is why he is gone. She said, can you prove it? I said, the public records show the transfer. The shell company links to Halcyon. That is enough for a warrant. She said, I will take it to the DA. Stay by your phone. I hung up. I paced my apartment. My mind was racing. If Lyle and Stern were embezzling from Meridian, they had a reason to silence Daniel. But how? Daniel was in a locked office. No one entered. No one left. The only way out was the window. Unless there was another way. I grabbed my coat and drove back to the Harcourt building. It was late afternoon now. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the downtown streets. I parked and went inside. The same security guard was at the desk. He recognized me. He said, "Back again?" I said, "I need to see the mechanical plans for the 14th floor." He frowned. He said, "Why?" I said, "I am looking for access points. ventilation ducts, service corridors, anything that connects to Garrett's office. He said, I do not have those. You would need to ask the building engineer. I said, where is he? He said, basement, maintenance office. I took the elevator down. The basement was cold and dim, lit by fluorescent tubes that flickered. I found the maintenance office at the end of a concrete hallway. The door was open. Inside, a man in coveralls was sitting at a desk, looking at a computer screen. I knocked. He looked up. I showed him my ID. I said, I need to see the mechanical plans for the 14th floor. He stood up. He was older, maybe 60, with a grey beard and tired eyes. He said, what are you looking for? I said, access points, any way into or out of the offices besides the doors. He opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a large rolled blueprint. He spread it out on the desk. He pointed to the layout. He said, each office has a ventilation duct, standard HVAC. The ducts run through the ceiling and connect to a central shaft that goes down to the mechanical room. I said, could someone fit through the ducts? He laughed. He said, no, they are 8 inches wide. You would need to be a cat. I said, what about service corridors? He pointed to a section of the blueprint. He said, there is a utility corridor that runs along the east side of the building. It houses electrical and plumbing risers. You can access it from the stairwell on each floor. I said, does it connect to the offices? He said no, it is sealed off. The only access is through locked service doors in the stairwell. I said, who has keys to those doors? He said, maintenance staff, building engineer. That is it. I said, could someone use the corridor to get to the 14th floor without being seen on camera? He thought about it. He said, technically yes, the corridor is not covered by security cameras, but you would need a key, and you would still have to enter the stairwell to access it. I said, and the stairwell has cameras. He said, correct. I stared at the blueprint. There had to be something I was missing. Some way Daniel left the office without being recorded. Some way someone else got in. I said, what about the window? Could someone have accessed it from the outside? He shook his head. He said, not unless they rappelled down from the roof, and even then, it would be nearly impossible. The building has no exterior maintenance rigging on that side. I said, what about the roof? Could someone access it? He said, yes. There is a roof access door on the 16th floor. It is locked, but the same keys that open the service corridor doors will open it. I felt my pulse quicken. I said, was the roof access used Monday night? He said, I do not know. The door does not have an alarm. It just locks. I said, could someone have gone to the roof, rappelled down to the 14th floor, entered through the window, and then left the same way? He looked at me like I was crazy. He said, in theory, yes, but it would be insane. 14 floors, no rigging, no safety equipment. One mistake and you are dead. I said, but it is possible. He said, anything is possible. That does not mean it happened. I thanked him and left. I took the elevator to the 16th floor. I found the roof access door at the end of the hallway. It was a heavy metal door with a keyhole. No keycard reader. No alarm. I tried the handle. Locked. I called Alvarez. I said, I need a key to the roof access at the Harcourt building. She said, why? I said, I think someone went to the roof Monday night and rappelled down to Garrett's office. She said, that is ridiculous. I said, it is the only explanation that fits. No one entered through the door. No one used the elevator or stairwell. The window was open from the inside. The only way that makes sense is if someone came from above. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I will get the key. Meet me there in 20 minutes. I waited in the hallway. The 16th floor was quiet. No offices up here, just storage rooms and mechanical equipment. At 6:15, Alvarez arrived with a uniformed officer. She had a key ring. She said, building engineer gave me these. She tried 3 keys before one worked. The door opened with a heavy click. A narrow staircase led up. We climbed it. At the top was another door. Alvarez unlocked it and pushed it open. The roof was flat, covered in gravel and roofing tar. HVAC units hummed in the corners. The sky was darkening. The city lights were coming on below. We walked to the edge facing east, the side where Garrett's office was. I looked down, 14 floors. The street below looked small and distant. Alvarez said, you really think someone climbed down from here? I said, look for anchor points, rope marks, anything that suggests rigging. We spread out and searched the roof. The officer checked the HVAC units. Alvarez checked the perimeter. I checked the edge where the roof met the wall. And then I found it. A small metal loop bolted into the roof surface near the edge. It was industrial grade, the kind used for securing equipment or safety lines. The metal was clean, no rust, no weathering. It looked new. I called Alvarez over. I said, look at this. She crouched down and examined it. She said, this was installed recently. I said, someone bolted this here so they could anchor a rope. She pulled out her phone and took pictures. She said, we need to test for rope fibers. I stood up and looked over the edge again. I counted down. 14th floor, Garrett's office. The window was closed now, but I could see which one it was by the layout. I said, someone anchored a rope here, rappelled down, entered through the window, did what they needed to do, and climbed back up. Alvarez said, that would take training, equipment, strength. I said, Richard Stern is 63. I do not think he could do it. She said, but someone younger could. I said, we need to find out who Stern knows with climbing experience. She said, or military background, or construction. I said, or someone who works in building maintenance. We both looked at each other. She said, Ron Pelletier. I said no. I already cleared him. He has no motive. She said, but he has the skills, and he has access to the building. I said, he also has an alibi. He was home Monday night. His neighbor saw him. She said, did you confirm that? I said no. She said, then we need to. We left the roof and went back downstairs. Alvarez called dispatch and asked them to send a unit to Pelletier's house. I called Pelletier directly. He answered on the third ring. I said, where were you Monday night, between 8 and 11? He said, I told you. I was home. I said, can anyone confirm that? He said, my neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She came over around 9 to borrow a drill. We talked for a few minutes. I said, what time did she leave? He said, maybe 9:15. I said, and after that? He said, I watched TV. I went to bed around 11. I said, did you go out at all? He said, no. Why are you asking me this again? I said, because we found evidence that someone used the roof to access Daniel Garrett's office. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I did not go to the roof. I was home. I said, do you know anyone who has climbing experience? He said, no. I said, have you ever installed anchor bolts on the roof of the Harcourt building? He said no. Why would I? I said, there is a new anchor bolt on the roof. It was installed recently. He said, I did not install it. I do maintenance, not modifications. Anything structural goes through the building engineer. I said, who is the building engineer? He said, Ed Kraus, the building manager. You met him. I hung up. I called Alvarez. I said, Pelletier says Ed Kraus handles structural modifications. She said, the building manager? I said, yes, the one who showed us the security footage. She said, he has access to everything. I said, and he was nervous when we questioned him. She said, I am going back to the building. Meet me there. I drove back to the Harcourt building. It was dark now. The lobby was empty except for the night security guard, a different one than before. Alvarez was waiting by the elevators. She said, Kraus left at 5. I called him. He is not answering. I said, do you have his address? She said, yes. Let us go. We took separate cars. Kraus lived in a suburb 20 minutes north. The house was a small ranch style with a 2-car garage. The lights were on inside. We parked on the street. Alvarez knocked on the front door. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. She tried the handle. Locked. She said, I am going to call for a warrant. I said, that will take hours. She said, we do not have probable cause to enter. I walked around to the side of the house. There was a window with the blinds open. I looked inside. A living room, a couch, a television on, and on the coffee table, a laptop. The screen was facing me. I could see it clearly. It was Daniel Garrett's laptop. The Meridian Capital logo was on the cover. I called Alvarez over. I said, look. She looked through the window. She said, that is probable cause. She called for backup. 2 patrol cars arrived within 10 minutes. Alvarez knocked on the door again. She shouted, Ed Kraus, this is the police. Open the door. No response. She nodded to one of the officers. He used a battering ram. The door splintered open. We entered with weapons drawn. The house was quiet. We cleared the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. We found Kraus in the back bedroom. He was sitting on the bed, his hands folded in his lap. He looked at us with empty eyes. He said, "I knew you would figure it out." Alvarez holstered her weapon. She said, "Ed Kraus, you are under arrest for kidnapping and murder." He did not resist. He stood up and put his hands behind his back. She cuffed him. I walked to the living room and looked at the laptop. I did not touch it. I waited for forensics. Alvarez brought Kraus out. He sat in the back of a patrol car. I stood outside and watched. The night was cold. The rain was starting again. Alvarez came over. She said, "He is asking for a lawyer." I said, "Did he say anything?" She said, "He said he did not mean to kill him." I felt a chill run through me. I said, "Where is the body?" She said, "He will not say." I looked at Kraus through the patrol car window. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale. I said, "We need to search his property and the building." She said, "Forensics is on the way." I went back inside the house. I walked through the rooms slowly. In the garage, I found climbing equipment, rope, carabiners, a harness, gloves, all of it clean, organized, stored on a wall rack. I took pictures. I called Alvarez in. She looked at the equipment. She said, "He did it. He rappelled down from the roof." I said, "But why? What is his connection to Stern and Lyle?" She said, "We will find out." Forensics arrived and took over the scene. I went back to my car. I sat there for a long time, thinking. Ed Kraus was the building manager. He had access to everything: the security system, the roof, the keys. He could have installed the anchor bolt. He could have altered the footage. He could have made it look like no one entered or left. But why would he kill Daniel Garrett? What was his motive? I called Linda Marsh. It was late, but she answered. I said, "Does Ed Kraus have any connection to Meridian Capital?" She said, "Not that I know of. He manages the building. That is it." I said, "What about Martin Lyle? Does Lyle know Kraus?" She said, "I do not think so." "Why?" I said, "Because Kraus just got arrested for Daniel's murder." She gasped. She said, "Oh my God." I said, "I need you to check the building contract. Who hired Kraus? Who pays him?" She said, "I will check. I will call you back." I hung up. 10 minutes later, she called. She said, "The building management contract is through a company called Sterling Facility Services." I said, "Who owns Sterling?" She said, "I do not know. It is a private company." I said, "Find out." She said, "I will." I drove back to the precinct. Kraus was in an interview room with his lawyer. Alvarez was watching through the glass. I stood next to her. I said, "What is he saying?" She said, "Nothing yet. His lawyer is advising him to stay quiet." I said, "We have the laptop. We have the climbing gear. We have the anchor bolt. That is enough to charge him. She said, but we do not have the body, and we do not have a motive. I said, we need to break him. She looked at me. She said, you want to try? I said, yes. She nodded. We went into the interview room. Kraus looked up. His lawyer said, my client has nothing to say. I sat down across from Kraus. I said, Ed, I know you did not want to kill Daniel Garrett. I know something went wrong. Tell me what happened. He stared at the table. I said, we found the climbing gear. We found the laptop. We know you went to the roof and rappelled down to his office. We know you opened the window and went inside. What we do not know is why. He looked at his lawyer. The lawyer shook his head. I said, was it Stern? Did he pay you? Or was it Lyle? Kraus's jaw tightened. I said, they used you. They made you do their dirty work. And now they are going to let you take the fall. He looked up. His eyes were wet. He said, they said he was going to ruin everything. His lawyer said, Ed, do not say another word. Kraus ignored him. He said, they said if he kept digging, we would all go to jail. They said I had to stop him. I said, who said that? Stern? He nodded. He said, Stern and Lyle. They came to me 3 weeks ago. They told me Daniel was investigating them. They told me I had to make it go away. I said, how? He said, they told me to scare him, to make him back off. But when I went into his office Monday night, he fought back. He tried to call for help. I panicked. I hit him. He fell. He hit his head on the desk. I felt my stomach turn. I said, where is he now? Kraus closed his eyes. He said, in the building, in the mechanical room. I sealed him in one of the utility closets. Alvarez stood up. She said, show us. Kraus sat in the back of the patrol car between 2 officers. Alvarez drove. I followed in my own vehicle. The rain was coming down harder now, sheets of water across the windshield. The city looked blurred and distant. We arrived at the Harcourt building just before midnight. The lobby was dark, except for emergency lighting. The night guard met us at the door. He looked confused and frightened. Alvarez showed him her badge and told him to wait outside. Kraus led us to the elevator. His hands were cuffed in front of him. He stared at the floor as we descended to the basement. The doors opened onto the same cold concrete hallway I had walked earlier. The fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed. We followed him down the corridor. He stopped at a door marked Mechanical Room B. He said, in here. Alvarez unlocked the door. Inside was a maze of pipes and electrical panels. The air was thick and warm. The sound of machinery hummed through the walls. Kraus pointed to the far corner. He said, behind the boiler, there is a utility closet. I sealed it with drywall and joint compound. It looks like part of the wall. 2 officers moved ahead of us. They found the section Kraus described. One of them knocked on the wall. It sounded hollow. He looked back at Alvarez. She nodded. He used a crowbar from the maintenance office. The drywall cracked and broke away. Dust filled the air. Behind it was a small closet, maybe 4 feet wide, and inside, wrapped in plastic sheeting, was Daniel Garrett. I turned away. I felt sick. Alvarez called for the medical examiner. She said, "Everyone out, except forensics." We left the mechanical room and went back upstairs. Kraus was taken to a holding cell. I stood in the lobby with Alvarez. She looked exhausted. She said, "We have him. Confession, physical evidence, the body. This is over." I said, "It is not over. Stern and Lyle ordered it. Kraus was just the one who did it." She said, "We need proof. Right now, all we have is Kraus saying they told him to scare Garrett. That is not the same as ordering a murder." I said, "Then we need to get them to talk." She said, "Stern already lawyered up. Lyle is still out of town. They will both deny everything." I said, "What about the financial records? The 11 million Lyle moved from Meridian to Halcyon." She said, "The DA is reviewing it, but financial fraud is not the same as murder. We can charge them with embezzlement, maybe conspiracy, but proving they ordered Kraus to kill Garrett is going to be hard." End quote. I said, "Kraus will testify." She said, "His lawyer will advise him to take a plea. Manslaughter instead of murder. He will say it was an accident. He will say Stern and Lyle just asked him to scare Garrett, not kill him." I said, "So they get away with it?" She said, "Maybe, unless we find something else." I left the building. The rain had stopped. The streets were wet and empty. I sat in my car and thought about everything that had happened. Daniel Garrett had found something. A discrepancy in the financial records. Transfers that did not make sense. Money moving from Meridian Capital into a shell company tied to Halcyon Properties. Martin Lyle, who worked for both companies, was the one moving it. Richard Stern, who owned Halcyon, was the one receiving it. Garrett had flagged it 6 months ago. Risk management had dismissed it, but Garrett had not stopped looking. He had kept digging. And 3 weeks ago, Stern and Lyle had realized he was getting too close. So they had gone to Ed Kraus, the building manager, a man they had leverage over, a man who owed them something, and they had told him to stop Garrett. Kraus had gone to the roof Monday night. He had used climbing equipment to rappel down to the 14th floor. He had opened the window from the outside and entered the office. He had confronted Garrett. They had fought. Garrett had died. Then, Kraus had panicked. He had carried the body to the mechanical room and sealed it in a closet. He had gone back to the office and staged the scene. He had left the window open to make it look like Garrett had jumped. He had altered the security footage to erase his own presence. But he had made mistakes. The footprints in the wet carpet, the limp that disappeared, the anchor bolt on the roof. And now he was in custody, but Stern and Lyle were still free. I called Linda Marsh. It was late, but I knew she would answer. She did. I said, "We found Daniel. He is dead." She made a sound like a sob. She said, "Oh God. Oh God." I said, "Ed Kraus killed him. Stern and Lyle ordered it." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Kraus confessed, but we need more evidence to tie Stern and Lyle to the murder. I need you to get me everything Daniel was working on. Every file, every email, every note." She said, "The laptop is at the police station." I said, I know, but there might be backups, cloud storage, external drives, anything. She said, I will check his desk tomorrow morning. I said, do it tonight. She said, the building is a crime scene. I said, then get permission. This is the only way we get justice for Daniel. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I will try. I hung up. I drove home. I did not sleep. I sat at my desk and went through everything again. The financial records, the timeline, the connections between Stern, Lyle, and Krause. And then I found it. Sterling Facility Services, the company that managed the Harcourt building, the company that employed Ed Krause. I pulled up the business registration. Sterling Facility Services was a private company registered in Delaware. The registered agent was a law firm. The ownership was hidden behind a corporate veil. But there was a contact address listed, an office in downtown Seattle, the same city where Martin Lyle was supposedly attending a conference. I called Alvarez. I said, Lyle owns Sterling Facility Services. She said, how do you know? I said, the company is registered to an address in Seattle. Lyle is in Seattle. That is not a coincidence. She said, that is not proof. I said, then get a subpoena, pierce the corporate veil, find out who really owns Sterling. She said, I will talk to the DA. I said, do it now. She said, it is 2 a.m. I said, Daniel Garrett is dead. His wife is going to get a call in a few hours telling her he is never coming home. Do it now. She hung up. I went back to my computer. I searched for everything I could find on Martin Lyle, his background, his career, his properties. He had worked in finance for 20 years. He had been CFO at 3 different companies before joining Meridian and Halcyon. He had no criminal record, no lawsuits, no complaints. But there was something, a news article from 8 years ago, a small piece in a Denver business journal. Martin Lyle had been questioned in connection with a financial investigation at his previous employer, a real estate investment firm called Cascade Holdings. The investigation had been dropped due to lack of evidence. I searched for more details. I found a follow-up article. Cascade Holdings had gone bankrupt 6 months after the investigation. The CEO had been charged with fraud and embezzlement. Martin Lyle had not been charged. He had left the company before the collapse. I sat back. This was his pattern. He joined companies, moved money around, covered his tracks, and left before anyone could catch him. And now he was doing it again at Meridian and Halcyon. My phone rang. It was Linda Marsh. She said, I am at the building. I got permission to access Daniel's desk. I said, what did you find? She said, a flash drive. It was taped to the underside of his desk drawer. I said, what is on it? She said, I do not know. It is encrypted. I said, bring it to me. She said, now? I said, yes. She arrived at my apartment 30 minutes later. She looked exhausted. She handed me the flash drive. I plugged it into my computer. The drive was password protected. I tried a few common passwords. None of them worked. Linda said, Daniel was careful. He would not use anything obvious. I said, what about personal information? His wife's name? His son's name? She said, his wife is Chloe. His son is Max. I tried both. Nothing. I said, what about dates? Birthdays? Anniversaries? She said, I do not know those. I looked at the photo I had taken from Daniel's office, the one with Chloe and Max. The label on the back said summer, no year. I tried summer, nothing. I tried Max summer, nothing. Then I tried the date format. If the photo was taken in summer, it would be June, July, or August. I tried 0615, nothing. 0715, nothing. 0815. The drive unlocked. Linda leaned over my shoulder. She said, what is on it? I opened the files. There were dozens of documents, spreadsheets, PDFs, scanned images of bank statements. I opened the first spreadsheet. It was a detailed analysis of the transfers between Meridian Capital and Crescent Advisors. Daniel had tracked every transaction for the past 2 years. The total was not 11 million. It was 43 million. Linda gasped. She said, oh my God. I opened another file. It was a memo Daniel had written to himself. It was dated 2 weeks ago. The memo said, ML and RS are moving client funds through CA into HP. The transfers are disguised as portfolio rebalancing and investment management fees. The clients do not know. The auditors do not know. I have copies of the authorization logs. The signatures are forged. I need to report this, but I do not know who to trust. LM is too close to ML. Risk management already dismissed my first report. If I go to the SEC, ML and RS will know it was me. I need more proof. I sat back. Daniel had known everything. He had documented everything. And he had been afraid to report it because he did not know who he could trust. Linda said, we have to give this to the police. I said, we will, but first I need to make copies. I copied the files to my computer and to a second flash drive. I handed the original back to Linda. I said, take this to Detective Alvarez. Tell her everything. She said, what are you going to do? I said, I am going to talk to Martin Lyle. She said, he is in Seattle. I said, then I am going to Seattle. She looked at me. She said, be careful. I said, I will. She left. I booked a flight to Seattle. The earliest one was at 6 in the morning. I packed a bag and left for the airport. The flight was 2 hours. I landed in Seattle just before 9. I rented a car and drove to the address for Sterling Facility Services. It was a small office in a commercial building near the waterfront. The sign on the door said Sterling Facility Services, Property Management Solutions. I went inside. The reception area was empty. No receptionist, no clients, just a desk and a few chairs. I walked to the back and found a hallway with 2 offices. One door was open. Inside, a man was sitting at a desk, looking at a computer screen. He looked up. He said, "Can I help you?" I said, I am looking for Martin Lyle. He frowned. He said, he is not here. I said, do you know where he is? He said, who are you? I showed him my ID. I said, I am investigating the death of Daniel Garrett. His face went pale. He said, I do not know anything about that. I said, do you work for Martin Lyle? He said, I work for Sterling. Mr. Lyle is a consultant. I said, what does he consult on? He said, building management, facility operations. I said, and Ed Krause? Does he work for Sterling? He hesitated. He said, he is one of our site managers. I said, did you know he killed someone? He stood up. He said, I do not know anything about that. You need to leave. I said, where is Martin Lyle? He said, I told you, he is not here. I said, then call him. He said, I do not have to do that. I said, you can call him, or I can come back with the police and a warrant. Your choice. He stared at me. Then he picked up his phone and dialed. He waited. Someone answered. He said, Mr. Lyle, there is someone here asking about Daniel Garrett. He listened. Then he handed me the phone. I said, Martin Lyle? A smooth voice said, who is this? I said, my name is not important. What is important is that Ed Krause confessed. He told us everything. He told us you and Richard Stern ordered him to stop Daniel Garrett. There was a pause. Then Lyle said, I do not know what you are talking about. I said, we have the financial records. We have the flash drive Daniel hid in his office. We have proof that you moved $43 million from Meridian Capital into Halcyon Properties. We have proof that the authorization signatures were forged. And we have Ed Krause saying you told him to make Daniel stop investigating. End quote. Another pause. Then Lyle said, Ed Krause is a liar. He killed Daniel on his own. I had nothing to do with it. I said, then explain why you own Sterling Facility Services. Explain why Sterling employs Ed Krause. Explain why you are paying him under the table. Lyle said, I am hanging up now. If you have any further questions, contact my lawyer. The line went dead. I handed the phone back to the man. I said, tell Martin Lyle that the police are coming for him. Tell him he can run, but it will not help. I left the office. I called Alvarez. I said Lyle is in Seattle. I just talked to him. He denied everything. She said, we got the subpoena. Sterling Facility Services is owned by a holding company. The holding company is owned by Martin Lyle and Richard Stern, 50-50. I said, so they are partners? She said, yes, and we have the financial records from the flash drive. The DA says it is enough to charge both of them with fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. I said, what about the murder charge? She said, Krause is cooperating. He is giving us everything. Text messages, emails, phone records. He says Stern and Lyle told him to make sure Daniel stopped investigating. Quote, by any means necessary. I said, That is a murder for hire. She said, yes, the DA is issuing arrest warrants for both of them. Where are you? I said, Seattle, at the Sterling office. She said, stay there. Seattle PD is on the way. I said, Lyle is going to run. She said, we are tracking his phone. We will find him. I hung up. I went back to my rental car and waited. 10 minutes later, 2 Seattle PD patrol cars pulled up. 4 officers got out. I met them at the entrance. I said, Martin Lyle was here. He called from another location. The man inside can give you more information. They went inside. I waited. 20 minutes later, one of the officers came out. He said, the employee says Lyle called from his hotel, the Fairmont Olympic. We are sending units there now. I said, I am coming with you. He said, no, this is police business. I said, I have been investigating this case for 3 days. I found the evidence. I am coming. He looked at me. Then he said, fine, but stay in your car. I followed the patrol cars to the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. It was a luxury hotel in downtown Seattle. The lobby was marble and crystal chandeliers. The officers went inside. I parked and waited. 5 minutes later, they came out with Martin Lyle in handcuffs. He was wearing a suit. He looked calm. He did not struggle. They put him in the back of a patrol car. I watched as they drove away. I called Alvarez. I said, they have Lyle. She said, good. Richard Stern is in custody here. We picked him up an hour ago. I said, what did he say? She said nothing. His lawyer is with him. But it does not matter. We have enough to prosecute both of them. I said, what happens now? She said, they will be arraigned. The DA will present the evidence. They will be charged with fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. If convicted, they are looking at 20 to 30 years. I said, and Ed Krause? She said, he is pleading guilty to manslaughter. He will testify against Stern and Lyle in exchange for a reduced sentence, probably 15 years. I said, that is not enough. She said, it is what we can get. The system is not perfect. I hung up. I sat in my car and stared at the hotel. The rain had started again. The windshield was covered in drops. Daniel Garrett was dead. His wife was now a widow. His son was now fatherless. And the men who had ordered his death would spend the rest of their lives in prison. It was not justice, not really, but it was something. I drove back to the airport. I caught a flight home. By the time I landed, it was dark. The city looked the same as always. Wet streets, blurred lights, people going about their lives, unaware of what had happened in that locked office on the 14th floor. I went home. I poured a glass of whiskey. I sat on my couch and stared at the wall. My phone buzzed. A text from Linda Marsh. It said, thank you. Chloe wants to meet you. She wants to thank you in person. I replied, tell her I am sorry for her loss. She replied, she knows, but she still wants to meet you. I said, tomorrow. I will come by tomorrow. She said, okay. I set my phone down. I finished my whiskey. I thought about Daniel Garrett, about how he had done the right thing, about how he had tried to expose corruption, about how it had cost him his life. And I thought about the men who had killed him, rich men, powerful men, men who thought they could get away with anything. But they had not gotten away with it, because Daniel had been careful, because he had left a trail, because he had hidden the evidence where someone would find it, and because I had not given up. I went to bed. I did not sleep well. I dreamed about locked offices and open windows and footprints in the rain. The next morning, I woke to grey light filtering through my apartment windows. The rain had stopped, but the sky was heavy with clouds. I made coffee and checked my phone. There was a message from Alvarez, arraignment at 10 a.m. Thought you should know. I drove to the courthouse. The building was old granite and stone, the kind that had seen decades of cases come and go. I found Alvarez outside courtroom 3. She was drinking coffee from a paper cup and talking to the prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 40s named Catherine Wells. Wells looked at me. She said, "You are the investigator." I said, "Yes." She said, "Your work was thorough. The evidence is solid. We are pushing for no bail on both defendants." I said, "Will you get it?" She said, "For Stern, probably. He has the resources to flee. For Lyle, I am less certain. His lawyer is arguing that he is not a flight risk." I said, "He owns properties in 3 states and has offshore accounts. He is absolutely a flight risk." She nodded. She said, "I will make that argument." The courtroom doors opened. We went inside. The room was half full. Reporters in the back rows. A few Meridian employees I recognized. And in the front, sitting alone, was a woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back. Next to her was a young boy, maybe 7 years old. Chloe and Max Garrett. I sat a few rows behind them. I did not want to intrude. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered. Richard Stern was brought in first, flanked by 2 deputies. He was wearing the same suit from yesterday. His lawyer sat beside him. The charges were read: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit murder. Stern stood silent while his lawyer entered a plea of not guilty. Wells stood. She said, "Your Honor, the state requests that the defendant be held without bail. Mr. Stern has significant financial resources and international connections. He poses a substantial flight risk." Stern's lawyer objected. He argued that Stern had cooperated with authorities, had no prior criminal record, and had deep ties to the community. The judge listened. Then she said, "Bail is set at $5 million, cash or bond. The defendant will surrender his passport and will be subject to electronic monitoring." Stern showed no reaction. His lawyer nodded. Next, Martin Lyle was brought in. He looked worse than the day before. His suit was wrinkled. His face was drawn. He did not look at anyone. The same charges were read. The same plea of not guilty. Wells made the same argument. Lyle's lawyer, a younger man with slick back hair, countered that Lyle had voluntarily returned from Seattle, had family in the area, and was willing to cooperate fully with the investigation. The judge said, "Bail is set at $2 million. same conditions. Lyle's lawyer looked relieved. The arraignment ended. The defendants were led out. I watched as Chloe Garrett stood up. She held her son's hand. The boy looked confused and scared. She walked toward the exit, but then she saw me. She stopped. She said, "Are you the investigator?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Linda told me what you did. Thank you." I said, "I am sorry. I could not save him." Her eyes filled with tears. She said, "You found him. You found out what happened. That is more than anyone else did." The boy looked up at me. He said, "Did you know my dad?" I crouched down so I was at his level. I said, "I did not know him personally, but I know he was a good man. He was trying to do the right thing." The boy said, "My mum says he is not coming home." I felt a knot in my throat. I said, "That is true, but he loved you very much, and he was brave. You should be proud of him." The boy nodded. He did not cry. He just held his mother's hand tighter. Chloe said, "I want to know everything. What happened? Why it happened? All of it." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Yes, I need to know." I said, "Okay, but not here, not now." She said, "Tomorrow?" I said, "Tomorrow." She thanked me again and left with her son. I watched them go. Alvarez came up beside me. She said, "That was hard." I said, "It always is." She said, end quote. Wells thinks we have a strong case. Krause is cooperating fully. The financial evidence is overwhelming, and the conspiracy charge is solid. I said, "When is the trial?" She said, "Probably 6 months, maybe longer if they drag it out." I said, "Will Chloe have to testify?" She said, "No, she is not a material witness, but she will be there. She has a right to be." I nodded. I left the courthouse and drove to my apartment. I spent the rest of the day writing up my final report. Every detail, every timeline, every piece of evidence. I wanted it documented. I wanted the record to be complete. That evening, Linda Marsh called me. She said, "The company is in chaos. Half the board wants to fire everyone. The other half wants to cover it up and move on." I said, "What about the clients? The ones whose money was stolen?" She said, "Wells is working with the SEC. They are going to try to recover the funds, but it will take time." I said, "How much was stolen in total?" She said, 43 million from Meridian, another 18 million from other sources we are still tracking. Stern and Lyle were running this for at least 3 years. I said, "And no one noticed?" She said, "Daniel noticed, and it killed him." I said, "What will you do?" She said, "I do not know. I feel like I failed him. I should have listened when he first flagged the discrepancy. I should have pushed harder." I said, "You did what you thought was right at the time. You trusted the system." She said, "The system failed." I said, "It fails a lot, but it worked in the end. Stern and Lyle are in custody. Krause is cooperating. justice is happening. She said, that does not bring Daniel back. I said, no, it does not. She hung up. I finished my report and sent it to Alvarez and to Wells. Then I poured another whiskey and sat on my couch. The city hummed outside my window. Rain started again, tapping against the glass. I thought about the case, about how it had started with a missing person report, about how it had unfolded piece by piece. The locked office, the open window, the wet footprints, the anchor bolt on the roof, the climbing gear, the laptop, the flash drive. Every piece had mattered. Every inconsistency had been a clue. And in the end, it had all led back to money, to greed, to two men who had decided that their wealth was more important than a man's life. The next day, I met Chloe Garrett at a coffee shop near her house. She came alone. Max was at school. She looked tired but composed. We sat at a corner table. I ordered coffee. She ordered tea. For a few minutes, we sat in silence. Then she said, "Tell me everything." I did. I told her about Daniel's work, about the discrepancy he had flagged 6 months ago, about how risk management had dismissed it, about how he had kept investigating on his own, about the shell company, about the transfers, about the $43 million that Stern and Lyle had stolen. I told her about Ed Krause, about how Stern and Lyle had pressured him, about how they had told him to stop Daniel by any means necessary, about how Krause had gone to the roof and rappelled down to Daniel's office, about the confrontation, about the fight, about how Daniel had died. I told her about how Krause had panicked and hidden the body, about how he had staged the scene, about how he had left the window open to make it look like a suicide, about how he had altered the security footage. And I told her about the flash drive, about how Daniel had documented everything, about how he had hidden it under his desk drawer, about how that evidence had brought Stern and Lyle down. When I finished, Chloe was crying. She wiped her eyes with a napkin. She said, "He knew it was dangerous." I said, "Yes." She said, "He told me he was working on something important. He said it might take a while, but he never said he was in danger." I said, "He probably did not want to worry you." She said, "I should have known. I should have asked more questions." I said, "You could not have known. Daniel was protecting you and Max." She looked out the window. She said, "What happens now?" I said, "Stern and Lyle will go to trial. They will be convicted. They will spend the rest of their lives in prison. Krause will serve 15 years. The money will be recovered. The clients will be made whole." She said, "And Max and me?" I said, "You will move forward, one day at a time. It will be hard, but you will survive." She looked at me. She said, "Will you be at the trial?" I said, "If you want me to be." She said, "I do." I said, "Then I will be there." She thanked me. We finished our drinks. She paid, even though I offered. She said, "Daniel would have wanted me to." I walked her to her car. She hugged me. She said, "Thank you for finding him. Thank you for not giving up." I said, "He deserved justice." She said, "Yes, he did." She drove away. I stood in the parking lot for a while, watching the traffic pass. The sky was still grey. The air was cold, but the rain had stopped. I went home. Over the next few months, I stayed in touch with Alvarez and Wells. The case moved through the system slowly. Stern and Lyle remained in custody. Both had posted bail, but the electronic monitoring kept them from fleeing. Krause pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the second degree. At his sentencing hearing, he read a statement. He said he was sorry. He said he had made a terrible mistake. He said he wished he could take it back. The judge sentenced him to 15 years, with the possibility of parole after 10. Chloe Garrett was in the courtroom. She did not speak. She just watched as Krause was led away. 6 months after Daniel's death, the trial began. It was held in the same courthouse where the arraignment had taken place. The media was there. The courtroom was packed. I sat in the gallery with Chloe. Max was not there. He was too young. Chloe said he was staying with her parents. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Wells presented the evidence methodically. The financial records, the forged authorization signatures, the transfers to the shell company, the emails between Stern and Lyle, the text messages to Krause. Krause testified. He told the jury everything. How Stern and Lyle had approached him, how they had told him Daniel was a problem, how they had paid him $50,000 to make Daniel stop investigating, how he had gone to the roof with climbing gear, how he had rappelled down to the 14th floor, how he had entered through the window, how Daniel had fought back, how he had hit Daniel with a wrench he had brought, how Daniel had fallen and hit his head, how he had sealed the body in the mechanical room. The defense tried to discredit him. They said he was lying to save himself. They said Stern and Lyle had never explicitly ordered a murder. They said Krause had acted on his own. But Wells had the text messages. One from Stern to Krause, sent the day before Daniel died. Make sure this problem goes away. Permanently. Another from Lyle to Krause, sent an hour later. Do what needs to be done. We will take care of you. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the third day, they came back with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Stern's lawyer immediately filed a motion for appeal. Lyle sat with his head in his hands. Chloe Garrett did not react. She just sat there, staring straight ahead. Sentencing was scheduled for a month later. When the day came, the courtroom was full again. Stern and Lyle were brought in wearing prison jumpsuits. They looked older, defeated. Wells gave her sentencing recommendation. She asked for the maximum: 30 years for conspiracy to commit murder, 20 years for fraud and embezzlement, to be served consecutively. The defense argued for leniency. They said Stern and Lyle had no prior criminal records. They said they had families. They said they were not a danger to society. The judge listened. Then she spoke. She said, "Mr. Stern and Mr. Lyle, you orchestrated a scheme to defraud your clients of millions of dollars. When Daniel Garrett discovered your crimes, you decided that his life was worth less than your freedom. You hired another man to silence him. You are directly responsible for his death. You have shown no remorse. You have shown no accountability. This court finds that you are a danger to society and that you deserve the maximum penalty under the law. She sentenced Richard Stern to 50 years in prison. She sentenced Martin Lyle to 45 years. Both men would be eligible for parole after serving 85% of their sentences. For Stern, that meant 42 years. He was 63. He would likely die in prison. For Lyle, that meant 38 years. He was 51. He would be nearly 90 if he ever got out. The courtroom was silent. The bailiffs led Stern and Lyle away. They did not look back. Chloe Garrett stood up. She walked out of the courtroom. I followed her. Outside, she stopped on the courthouse steps. The sun was out for the first time in weeks. The sky was clear. She turned to me. She said, "It is over." I said, "Yes." She said, "I do not feel relieved. I thought I would, but I just feel empty." I said, "That is normal. Justice does not bring people back. It just closes the chapter." She said, "What do I tell Max?" I said, "Tell him the truth. Tell him his father was a hero. Tell him that bad people tried to silence him, but they failed. Tell him that his father's courage brought them to justice." She nodded. She said, "Thank you for everything." I said, "Take care of yourself. And Max." She said, "I will." She walked down the steps and got into her car. I watched her drive away. Alvarez came out of the courthouse. She stood next to me. She said, 50 years. That is a long time." I said, "Not long enough." She said, "Maybe, but it is what we got." I said, "Daniel Garrett did not get 50 years. He did not get another day." She said, "No, but his son will grow up knowing his father did the right thing, and that the men who killed him paid for it." I said, "I hope that is enough." She said, "It has to be." We stood there for a while, watching people come and go. The city moved around us. Life continued. Cases closed. New ones open. Eventually, Alvarez said, "What will you do now?" I said, "Go home, write my final report, move on to the next case." She said, "Do you ever think about the people?" I said, "All the time." She said, "Does it get easier?" I said, "No, you just get used to it." She nodded. She said, "Take care." I said, "You too." She went back inside. I walked to my car. The sun was warm on my face. The air smelled clean. I drove home. I sat at my desk and wrote the final entry in my report. I documented the trial, the verdict, the sentencing. I closed the file and saved it. Then I sat back and stared at the wall. Daniel Garrett had been dead for 7 months. His killers were in prison. His family was moving on. The case was closed. But I still thought about that office, about the locked door and the open window, about the footprints in the wet carpet, about the anchor bolt on the roof. I thought about how close it had come to being a perfect crime. How if Krauss had not left those footprints, if he had not installed that anchor bolt, if Daniel had not hidden that flash drive, the case might never have been solved. And I thought about all the other cases like this one, the ones where the evidence does not add up, the ones where the killers are smarter, the ones where justice never comes. Those cases kept me awake at night. Those cases made me keep digging. Those cases reminded me why I did this work. Because someone has to. I closed my laptop. I stood up and walked to the window. The city spread out before me. Millions of people, millions of stories, some of them ending in tragedy, some of them ending in justice. And somewhere out there, another case was waiting. Another locked door, another open window, another set of clues that did not quite fit. I would find it. I would follow it. I would not give up. Because that is what I do. That is who I am. I am the one who keeps looking when everyone else has stopped. I am the one who finds the truth when it has been buried. I am the one who makes sure that people like Daniel Garrett are not forgotten. And as long as there are cases like this, I will keep working. I will keep searching. The rain started again that evening. I listened to it drumming against the windows while I went through my notes one more time. Not the new case, the old one. Daniel Garrett's case. There was something about closing a file that always felt incomplete. You put the words on the page, you document the evidence, you write the final report, but the weight of it does not go away. It stays with you. I thought about Chloe and Max, about how they would spend the rest of their lives without Daniel, about birthdays and holidays and graduations where his absence would be felt, about the small moments, the everyday things that would remind them of what they lost. I thought about Linda Marsh, about how she would carry the guilt of not pushing harder when Daniel first flagged the discrepancy, about how she would second-guess every decision she made going forward. I thought about Ed Krause, about how one decision had destroyed his life, about how he had let fear and money turn him into a killer, about how he would spend the next 15 years in a cell, replaying that night over and over. And I thought about Richard Stern and Martin Lyle, about how they had built their wealth on lies and theft, about how they had convinced themselves that they were entitled to it, about how they had decided that one man's life was an acceptable price to pay for their freedom. They would have decades in prison to think about that decision, but I doubted they would ever truly understand what they had done. Men like that rarely do. My phone buzzed. A text from Alvarez, final autopsy report came through. Thought you should see it. She sent me a PDF. I opened it on my laptop. The medical examiner had been thorough. The report confirmed what we already knew. Blunt force trauma to the head. Skull fracture. Subdural hematoma. Death would have been quick, probably within minutes. But there was a note at the end that I had not seen before. The medical examiner had found defensive wounds on Daniel's hands, bruises on his knuckles, scratches on his palms. He had fought back, hard. I sat back and stared at the screen. Daniel had not gone quietly. He had resisted. He had tried to save himself. That mattered. It mattered because it meant he had not given up. It meant he had fought until the very end. I closed the report and stood up. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. The rain was heavier now. The streets were slick and shining under the streetlights. Somewhere out there, in another office or another home, someone else was discovering something they should not have seen. Someone else was asking questions that made powerful people uncomfortable. Someone else was about to become a problem that needed to be solved. And when that happened, I would be ready. I would take the case. I would follow the evidence. I would find the truth. Because that is what Daniel Garrett had done. He had seen something wrong, and he had refused to look away. He had kept digging even when it was dangerous. He had documented everything because he knew someone would need to find it. He had trusted that justice would come eventually, and it had. I thought about the new case waiting for me. The college student, the locked dorm room, the impossible circumstances. Tomorrow, I would start digging into that one. I would request the case file. I would talk to the local police. I would visit the scene. I would start asking questions. But tonight, I needed to let this case go. I needed to close the door on Daniel Garrett's story, not because I wanted to forget it, but because I had done everything I could. The investigation was complete. The killers were in prison. The family had answers. My job was finished. I walked back to my desk and opened the file folder one last time. I looked at the photos, the office, the open window, the wet footprints, the anchor bolt on the roof, the climbing gear in Krause's garage, the laptop with the Meridian logo. Each piece of evidence told a story. Together, they told the whole story. I closed the folder and put it in my filing cabinet. I labeled it with the date and Daniel's name. Then I locked the drawer. I made one more cup of coffee and sat down on my couch. The rain kept falling. The city kept moving. And somewhere in that city, Chloe Garrett was putting her son to bed. She was probably telling him a story. She was probably promising him that everything would be okay. And maybe, eventually, it would be. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. Because Daniel had made sure the truth came out. He had left the evidence where it could be found. He had trusted that someone would care enough to look. And I had cared. I had looked. I had not stopped until I found him. That was my promise. To every victim, to every family, to everyone whose story needed to be told. I would keep looking. I would keep searching. I would never stop until the truth was uncovered. I finished my coffee and set the cup down. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain. It was a steady, rhythmic sound, constant and unchanging. Like the work I did, like the cases that kept coming, like the need for justice that never went away. I thought about the locked office one more time, about Daniel sitting at his desk, working late, unaware that someone was on the roof above him, unaware that his life was about to end because he had done the right thing. He had deserved better. He had deserved to go home to his wife and son. He had deserved to see his child grow up. He had deserved to be celebrated for his courage instead of killed for it. But the world is not fair. I had learned that a long time ago. Good people die. Bad people prosper. Justice is slow and imperfect, but it is still worth fighting for. Because when it works, when the evidence comes together and the truth emerges and the killers face consequences, it means something. It means that one life mattered. It means that one family got answers. It means that one case was not forgotten. And that has to be enough. I opened my eyes. The rain was starting to ease. The clouds were breaking up. Through the window, I could see a few stars emerging in the night sky. I stood up and walked to the bedroom. I was tired, bone deep tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying other people's grief, from walking through crime scenes, from piecing together the last moments of someone's life. But I would sleep tonight. I would rest. And tomorrow I would wake up and start again. Because there was always another case, another locked door, another impossible mystery. And I would be there to solve it. I lay down on the bed and closed my eyes. The sound of the rain faded. The city grew quieter. And in that silence, I thought about Daniel Garrett one last time. I hoped he was at peace. I hoped he knew that his death had not been in vain. I hoped he knew that his family would be taken care of. I hoped he knew that the men who killed him would pay for what they did. And I hoped he knew that someone had cared enough to find the truth. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, I dreamed of open windows and falling rain and footprints that told stories. I dreamed of evidence carefully hidden and eventually found. I dreamed of justice, imperfect but real. And when I woke the next morning, the sun was shining. The rain had stopped. The city looked clean and new. I made coffee. I opened my laptop. I started reading the case file for the college student in the locked dorm room. A new case, a new mystery, a new chance to find the truth. And I was ready.